hopefully that's got everybody onto the right slide. Thanks for that. So what I'm going to cover, as Nicola rightly said, and good morning everybody, is the legislation framework, particularly looking at sort of how we've got to where we are, some of the context around that, the legal framework itself, particularly looking at the IPM elements. So some of that we'll be looking in a bit more detail at some of the points that Henry raised, which is a fascinating study. And then, as you might expect at this time of year, a little bit about the future as well. In terms of context for where we are now, there are a range of government strategies, some of which are fairly recent, some of which are still being developed. So we have things like the DEFRA 25-year environment plan, which came out a couple of years ago, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The various other administrations' plans, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Then there are some wider things which of course impact on pesticide use and crop production, particularly when you get onto things like minimum tillage and such like. So the carbon net zero targets and all the work that's been done on that, and indeed the wider biodiversity targets, and what the government's trying to do around the new agricultural payments. And then of course there's a wider international context of trading standards, how we work with international partners, and indeed how we work with the EU going forward. So there's a whole bag of things that sit around all this legislation framework, and which will obviously influence how things go forward in a number of ways. Looking more specifically at the 25-year environment plan, which obviously focuses on a number of areas which will affect the future National Action Plan for sustainable use of pesticides. The three headlines that I really wanted to bring out of the pesticide section are about actually having regulation of pesticides developing with scientific knowledge and continuing this direction now that we've left the EU. Having IPM at the heart of this approach, and taking a holistic approach, as I mentioned, by ensuring that all the policies support sustainable crop protection with minimum use of pesticides and the whole IPM emphasis. And then the third key factor in the environment, in the 25-year environment plan, was about reviewing the existing National Action Plan, which I'll give you more details on the existing plan, and then looking at a new National Action Plan to take all these things forward for the next 5 years. Looking at the overall legislative framework for plant protection products, there's obviously the three phases to cover. There's the whole system of before things actually get on the market. There's the rules around the use of pesticides, and of course all the things that happen once pesticides have been used. And the legislation, I'll put them all up at once. There's legislation around all of this, which stems from the thematic strategy that the EU introduced in 2007. The strategy came out, the legislation was agreed in 2009. And basically, again, to take this holistic approach to how pesticides are authorised, used and controlled in general. And particularly bearing in mind around the use and IPM sector, there were no common rules at EU level. So there was a large gap there. There were a number of different things going on in different countries at the time, different member states. And obviously the UK had a fair lot of things going on. But as I say, there were no common rules. And another interesting point, and very much in line with what Henry said, was the whole fact of there was no measurement of progress as well. So the legislation tried to introduce measurements with the statistics regulation and indicators, again to try and get a sort of common feel for what was going on use of pesticides. So the Sustainable Use Directive itself was trying to set out this framework which reduces risks and impacts of pesticide use on health and the environment, promoting the use of IPM, and promoting the use of alternative approaches and alternative techniques as well and particularly non-chemical alternatives to pesticides. It gave a number of key areas for member state actions, again to try and draw everybody into line, many of which the UK was already doing anyway, and it was implemented into national regulations. So we've got secondary legislation which is there in the UK and sets out the rules for sustainable use in the pesticides regulations. As Henry quite rightly raised, there are no end of definitions of IPM. This one that is the one in the Sustainable Use Directive, which is carried forward into the UK legislation, I think came from an international definition, which was basically trying to take account of all the factors that you're doing in IPM, that you are actually looking at all the possible methods and trying to integrate measures, taking account of economically and ecologically justified whilst reducing and minimising risks. So that's the one that we work to. It's difficult to try and encapsulate that in a few words. Better people than me have tried and will no doubt continue to try. But that's what we're trying to get at, of trying to bring everything together in IPM and get people to have very sophisticated decision making. A little bit more on the principles of IPM. Henry mentioned the 8 principles. Again, some of these can look a bit clunky, bearing in mind that they're in legislation and the legislation was drawn up effectively by committee. It tries to capture the key elements from all the different sort of everybody's inputs, particularly around sort of suppression of organisms, monitoring and tools, particularly around forecasting, diagnosis systems and advice, and then picks up the point about, based on all this monitoring and advice, you have to make a decision on what to do, and that decision will obviously change as time goes on as well. It stresses the importance of thresholds, which is another key area of work. It tries to get people to prefer other methods rather than chemical ones if they actually provide satisfactory pest control, and of course again that will depend on circumstances. It encourages users to keep the pesticides to levels that are necessary and ensuring that they're targeted to where they're supposed to go. Particularly focuses on risk of resistance to make sure that you have resistance strategies, again all part of sustainable use. And then actually that feedback loop of actually saying, well, once you've used them and you're monitoring, actually did it do what it was meant to do? So there's something important there. So those are the principles in a bit more detail that Henry mentioned. That's what the current National Action Plan looked like, which was published in 2013, was largely written by HSE at the time on behalf of the government departments, but with their input. The priority areas in the National Action Plan at that point were around improving practice, particularly in the amateur and amenity sector, bearing in mind we're trying to bring all pesticide users up to a high standard of use and sustainable use. There's a large emphasis on the protection of water, particularly given the importance of water resources and the need to make sure that water is protected and that there's a lot of communication. Particularly at that point it was talking around catchment sensitive farming, and again that's come on significantly since the National Action Plan, and indeed was progressing before then. And integrated approaches were stressed as a priority area, this point about pesticides being part of a range of control measures, enhancing understanding of integrated approaches, again another point well raised by Henry, and maximising effectiveness of any R&D in this area. Government activity at that point into IPM was really making sure that IPM was embedded in the training programs. So because it was sort of coming on as it was already there in horticulture, but had less emphasis. So it was about making sure the training programs actually picked up the 8 principles. Similarly with any practice documents, particularly in some areas like amenity, for example. There's a lot of regulatory activity, such as the biopesticide scheme and the work done there to encourage and help biopesticides get through the system or and be available to users. Obviously, in terms of wider government measures, there was support for conversion to organic production. Big efforts in government and wider on awareness raising, and in terms of evidence and information gathering as to what was going on. Obviously, his work has progressed significantly in the last couple of years as well. So that's a key piece of work that he's done separately. Stakeholder activity. The IPM plan evolved out the crop protection management plan with the voluntary initiative and others. And is now sort of moving on again to another new level, which is great to see. Stakeholders themselves were looking at training programs, and the assurance schemes were looking at how they covered IPM. Similarly, in terms of monitoring, again, we're trying to see what's going on with IPM use. Research and knowledge transfer, and again information to users, all key activities that were going on in a number of places, and again trying to bring in awareness of what's going on and how people can benefit from it. A bit more about the national regime going forward now, because obviously we're in a different place to where we were. So from January, we will have a new independent regulatory system in Great Britain and take out responsibility for our own decisions. So all the existing rules are carried over. So the sustainable use rules are carried over, but tweaked where necessary to make sure they're operable in a national regime. Same with all the authorization rules. Again, so we have a seamless transition to a national regime and ensure that all approvals authorizations are carried over. There's a bit of detail there around the validity of authorizations, and also the fact that we will be extending active substance approvals, again as part of this, ensuring that we have a smooth transition to a national regime. Of course, the important point to note at the bottom is that the Northern Ireland regime will follow the EU rules, given the Northern Ireland Protocol. But that's, as I say, that's just where we are. So there will be sort of 2 systems to operate. Perhaps of more interest as well, given the discussion on IPM, government, the 4 administrations, DEFRA and the devolves, have just put together a new draft national action plan, which they expect to consult on shortly. And again, it's got a high level aim to minimise the risks and impacts of pesticides to health and the environment, whilst ensuring pests and pesticide resistance are managed effectively. Some of the draft key goals are there in that, again, it's continuing the need for robust regulation. It's supporting the development and uptake of IPM, ensuring that those who use pesticides do so sustainably. Again, this big point around improving metrics and indicators. We need to be able to measure where we've got to on things. And also a key point here, again, that government works effectively with other partners to deliver the National Action Plan goals. It's not just for government to do. Stakeholders of all parties have their part to play, and outside non-government organisations are a very strong tool to deliver these things. This draft National Action Plan consultation is UK-wide. As I say, it's been developed in conjunction with all 4 administrations and to apply to all pesticide users, and as I say, should be issued shortly, and we would encourage you all to take part in it. And that was all I wanted to say as a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully it's given you a flavour of how we've got to where we are, and where we are actually about to go as well. So that's it from me. Thanks, Nicola.
That's great. Thanks very much, Adrian.